The room fell silent. Charles Spencer, Princess Diana's brother, stepped up to the podium at the Victoria and Albert Museum, visibly holding a blue paper that was not in the teleprompter. Within minutes, the carefully constructed royal narrative around Queen Camilla's image collapsed in front of shocked aristocrats and live cameras. But what was on those papers, and why did the palace's unity message backfire so spectacularly? The truth exposes a stunning family battle still raging decades after Diana's death. Before we uncover what really happened, tell us in the comments, what do you think is the biggest misunderstanding about this story? The invitation arrived on Charles Spencer's desk in a cream envelope bearing the royal seal. It was formal, elegant, and utterly unremarkable by aristocratic standards. The annual royal gala at the Victoria and Albert Museum had been a fixture on the Spencer family calendar for generations, a glittering affair where titles were exchanged like currency and the royal family's carefully curated image was put on display for the elite of British society. But for Charles Spencer, the 9th Earl Spencer, this invitation carried weight that no one in the palace seemed to appreciate. He had been to dozens of these gatherings, smiled through countless photo opportunities, and performed the delicate dance of being royal adjacent without ever fully belonging to the inner circle. What made this particular invitation so significant was not the embossed lettering or the promise of champagne, but rather the timing and the audience. The room would be packed with the very people who had once whispered behind their hands at Diana's funeral. The same aristocrats who had watched him deliver that searing eulogy in Westminster Abbey, his voice cracking with grief and barely contained fury as he publicly questioned the royal family's treatment of his sister. They had all been there, frozen in their silk and pearls, listening as he promised Diana's sons would never suffer their mother's fate. Now, decades later, many of those same faces would be watching him ascend the podium once again. Charles understood something that the palace's event planners clearly did not. He had been quietly gathering his thoughts for years, revisiting old letters, re-examining family history, and coming to terms with the ways in which his sister's story had been rewritten by those who survived her. The gala was being positioned as a celebration of royal unity, a chance to showcase the monarchy's modern face with Camilla as its leading lady. What the palace didn't know was that Charles had brought his own script. Behind the scenes, tensions had been simmering for weeks. When the invitation first arrived, Charles had called his eldest daughter, Lady Kitty Spencer, to discuss whether attending would be interpreted as an endorsement of the current royal setup. Their conversation was careful, measured, but the underlying question was unmistakable. Was it finally time to speak again? The royal family, for their part, seemed to believe that enough time had passed. They calculated that Charles had made his peace with the past, that his public appearances alongside Prince William and Prince Harry indicated a thawing of old wounds. What they failed to account for was the depth of Charles Spencer's conviction. He had never truly moved on from his sister's death, not in the way the world had expected. He had simply been waiting for the right moment to say what he had always wanted to say. That moment arrived on a cold November evening, as Charles stood in his study reviewing the speech he had written in secret. The pages were covered in his own handwriting, crossed-out sections, and margin notes that spoke to years of frustration. He had shown the speech to no one, not his wife, not his children, not even his closest friends. Some truths needed to be delivered alone. The palace had made a critical miscalculation. They assumed Charles Spencer was coming to the gala to play his assigned role. The noble brother, the respectful aristocrat, the man who had moved on. They had no idea that he was preparing to deliver the most explosive speech of his life, a revelation that would leave the royal establishment reeling and Queen Camilla stunned in her seat. As the Spencer family car pulled up to the V&A's grand entrance that night, flashbulbs exploding in the winter darkness, Charles stepped out with an expression that photographers would later describe as serene. But there was steel in his eyes, the same steel that had flashed in Westminster Abbey over 2 decades earlier. He was ready. What he didn't know was that a last-minute change to the evening's program had placed him directly before the Queen Consort's own remarks. Some called it coincidence. Others would later call it a setup. Either way, the stage was set for a confrontation that no one in that gilded hall could possibly have anticipated. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe so you never miss our next documentary. The moment Charles Spencer stepped onto the stage, something was undeniably different. He carried no notes in his hand, no folder, No cards, just a single folded sheet of blue paper that he placed deliberately on the podium beside the teleprompter. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible to anyone not watching closely. But those who knew him, who remembered the last time he stood before a grieving nation, understood exactly what that folded paper meant. The teleprompter glowed with the palace-approved text, carefully crafted by royal communications officers to emphasize unity, healing, and the forward march of the monarchy. Charles glanced at it once, then looked out at the sea of expectant faces. The room was filled with the great and the good, aristocrats who had known his family for generations, politicians who had once courted his sister's favor, and members of the royal household who had spent decades managing the Diana narrative. What happened next caught everyone off guard. Charles Spencer cleared his throat and began to speak, but not from the teleprompter. His words were measured, deliberate, carrying the weight of someone who had spent years choosing exactly what to say. He spoke of legacy, of the importance of truth in preserving history, and of the responsibility that comes with being a custodian of someone else's story. The audience listened politely, assuming this was the standard fare of royal gala speeches. Then he reached for the blue paper. According to the video that later circulated across social media platforms, the contents of that paper was something the palace had never authorized and would never have approved. Legal documents, carefully prepared over 6 months of work with lawyers, outlining a new trust that would take control of Diana's personal archives. Not just letters and photographs, but journals, private correspondence, and recordings that had remained sealed for nearly 3 decades. The palace's carefully crafted narrative of unity and healing was, in that moment, shattered. Charles wasn't just giving a speech, he was announcing a seismic shift in who would control Diana's voice going forward. And he had done it with the kind of legal precision that left even the most seasoned royal advisors scrambling. But the most shocking detail was yet to come. The trust, Charles explained, would be overseen by Diana's sons. Not the palace, not the royal family's appointed handlers. Her sons, the very people Diana had loved above all else, would finally have control over their mother's story. And as if that weren't enough, he added that the process had been supported by Prince William himself, a revelation that sent visible shockwaves through the room. The audience's polite applause turned to murmurs of disbelief. Camilla, seated in the front row, had gone pale. For years, the palace had operated on the assumption that Diana's legacy could be managed, shaped, and eventually absorbed into the larger royal narrative. But this was something else entirely. This was Diana's family reclaiming her voice, and they had chosen a gala celebrating royal unity to make their stand. What Charles had done was brilliant in its simplicity. By placing the announcement within the framework of a formal speech, he had made it impossible for the palace to ignore or suppress. The cameras were rolling, the press was present, and every word had been recorded. The blue paper wasn't just a prop. It was a legal document that had been designed to withstand any challenge from the royal household. As he concluded that section of his speech, Charles stepped back from the podium. The blue paper remained there, visible to everyone in the room. It was a symbol, and everyone understood its meaning. The Spencer family had drawn a line, and they would not be moved from it. But that was only the beginning. The speech was far from over, and the most explosive part was yet to come. Because Charles Spencer had not come to the Victoria and Albert Museum to talk about archives and trusts. He had come to finally address something far more personal, something the royal family had hoped he would never mention again. If this story surprised you, share it with someone who would enjoy uncovering forgotten Hollywood stories. Charles Spencer had read the words on that teleprompter before. They were careful, diplomatic, and utterly predictable, the kind of speech the palace had been writing for him since 1997. It spoke of unity, of moving forward, of respecting the institution that had once made his sister's life a living nightmare. If he had read those words, the evening would have ended with polite applause and another chapter in the carefully managed royal narrative. But Charles didn't read the teleprompter. Instead, he reached for the blue paper he had placed on the podium, the document he had spent 6 months constructing with lawyers who specialized in protecting legacies from powerful institutions. The irony was not lost on him. He had come to a gala celebrating royal unity to announce something that would shatter that unity entirely. The room, filled with Britain's elite and members of the royal household, watched as Charles began to speak from the heart. His voice carried the same weight it had in Westminster Abbey, the same quiet intensity that had once made a grieving nation hold its breath. He spoke not as an aristocrat performing his social duty, but as a brother who had spent nearly 3 decades watching his sister's story be rewritten by those who had survived her. What the palace had not anticipated was the legal precision of his words. Charles announced the creation of a new trust, an airtight legal structure that would transfer control of Diana's personal archives from royal oversight to the hands of her sons, Prince William and Prince Harry. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was a strategic move designed to ensure that Diana's voice would never again be managed by the institution that had, in his view, failed to protect her. According to those who were present, the moment Charles mentioned Prince William's support for the trust, the atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. If William had quietly endorsed this move, it represented a significant breach in the palace's carefully constructed unity. The heir to the throne, it seemed, had chosen his mother's legacy over the institution's narrative. Camilla, seated in the front row, reportedly went pale. For years, the palace had operated on the assumption that time would soften Diana's memory, that the royal family could eventually reclaim the narrative and move forward. But Charles Spencer had just demonstrated that some legacies cannot be managed, some voices will not be silenced, and some brothers will never stop protecting the sister they lost too soon. The blue paper remained on the podium as Charles concluded that section of his speech. It was a symbol of everything the royal family had tried to bury, the inconvenient truth that Diana's story belonged to her family, not to the institution that had been complicit in her suffering. And as the murmurs spread through the gilded hall, it became clear that this was only the beginning. Because Charles Spencer had not come to the Victoria and Albert Museum simply to announce a legal trust. He had come to deliver a message that had been building for decades, one that would leave the royal establishment reeling and force the world to confront the uncomfortable truths that had been buried beneath royal ceremony and public relations. The teleprompter was dark now, and Charles Spencer was speaking with a voice that had been waiting far too long to be heard. If this story surprised you, share it with someone who would enjoy uncovering forgotten Hollywood stories. Charles Spencer stood at that podium in the Victoria and Albert Museum, and for a moment, the grand hall fell away. The chandeliers, the aristocrats, the flashing cameras, all of it dissolved into background noise. What remained was something far more personal, far more raw than any legal announcement about archives and trusts. What remained was a brother finally speaking the words he had been holding back for nearly 3 decades. The blue paper had done its job. The announcement of Diana's archive trust had landed like a thunderclap, leaving the royal establishment scrambling and Camilla visibly shaken. But Charles was not finished. He had come to this gala with a single folded sheet of paper and a heart full of unfinished business. And now, with the teleprompter dark and the palace's carefully crafted narrative in ruins, he began to speak about something the royal family had hoped he would never mention again. He spoke about the night his sister called him, her voice trembling, after giving birth to her second son. He spoke about the words that had been said in that hospital room, words that Diana had carried with her until her dying day. According to those who later pieced together the account, the then Prince Charles had visited his wife in the Lindo wing, looked at his newborn son, and remarked on his red hair. Diana had replied with quiet dignity, "But, Charles, you know that's the Spencer gene." Then came the blow that had shattered her. "Well," the prince had allegedly said, "at least I've got my heir and spare now, and I can return to Camilla." Diana had lain in that hospital bed, still recovering from labor, and watched her husband walk out the door, not just physically, but emotionally. She told her close friend Paul Burrell years later, "I cried myself to sleep that night knowing my marriage was over." She had given him 4 years, she said, 4 good years, and he was gone. Charles Spencer had known this story for decades. His sister had confided in him, the brother who had been her childhood companion, the one who had fought with her at school and endured those long train journeys between their parents' homes with her on weekends. He had watched her suffer in silence, had seen the eating disorders, the insecurity, the desperate need to prove herself worthy of love. And he had never forgotten a single detail. Now, standing in that gilded hall, he was finally speaking the words his sister had never been allowed to say publicly. He spoke of the pressures she had endured, the relentless pursuit by the media that had driven her to tearful despair. He spoke of the palace's complicity in her suffering, the way duty and tradition had been weaponized against a young woman who had only ever wanted to be loved. But Charles was not content to simply rehash old wounds. He was building a case, carefully, methodically, using the weight of history to expose patterns that had been hidden in plain sight. He reminded the audience of the eulogy he had delivered at Westminster Abbey in 1997, the one where he had pledged that Diana's sons would not be simply immersed by duty and tradition, but can sing openly as you planned. That speech had angered the royal family, had created a rift that took years to heal. But Charles had never regretted a single word. And now, he was telling the world why. The most devastating part of his speech, according to those who witnessed it, was not the legal announcements or the historical grievances. It was the quiet, almost gentle way he described his sister's final years. She had been looking for a new direction, he said, had talked endlessly of getting away from England, mainly because of the treatment she received at the hands of the newspapers. She had wanted to protect her sons from the same fate, had wanted them to grow up free from the anguish that used regularly to drive you to tearful despair. Charles looked directly at Camilla as he spoke these words. The queen consort, who had once been the other woman in Diana's marriage, who had waited decades to claim the throne she now occupied, sat frozen in her seat. The cameras captured every flicker of emotion on her face, every moment of discomfort that she could not hide behind royal protocol. But Charles was not done. He had one more revelation to deliver, one that would tie together everything he had said and leave the royal establishment reeling. If you enjoyed this documentary, like the video and subscribe for more true celebrity stories every week. Charles Spencer stood at the podium, the blue paper now folded neatly in his pocket, its legal work complete. But the silence in the room told him that the audience knew something else was coming. He had spoken of the trust, of Diana's archives, of the legal structure designed to protect her voice from royal interference. And then, with the weight of decades behind him, he began to speak the words that had been haunting him since Westminster Abbey. He spoke of the night his sister called him from the Lindo wing, her voice trembling with a pain that had nothing to do with childbirth. He described how the then Prince of Wales had visited his wife, looked at their newborn son, and remarked on his red hair. Diana, ever the protector of a family, had replied with quiet dignity. "But, Charles, you know that's the Spencer gene." Then came the blow that had shattered her. According to Diana's own account to her friend and butler Paul Burrell, Charles allegedly said, "Well, at least I've got my heir and spare now, and I can return to Camilla." The room gasped. Camilla's face, captured by every camera in the hall, was a mask of controlled composure betrayed by the pallor beneath it. She had been the other woman in that hospital room, the phantom presence that had ended any hope Diana might have held for her marriage. And now, decades later, a brother was speaking the words his sister had never been allowed to say publicly. Charles continued, his voice steady but filled with the weight of memory. He described how Diana had cried herself to sleep that night, knowing her marriage was over. 4 years, Paul, I gave him 4 good years and he was gone, Diana had told her confidant. For the rest of the time I had to pretend and put on a facade to the world. The world had watched Diana smile, had seen her wave to crowds, had witnessed her grace under pressure. But behind the facade, as Charles made clear, was a woman who had been systematically broken by an institution that valued tradition over humanity. This was not just a speech. It was a reckoning. Every word Charles spoke was a reminder of the human cost behind the royal pageantry, a cost that had been hidden for decades behind carefully managed narratives and palace spin. The blue paper might have been the legal weapon, but these words were the emotional truth that no legal document could ever contain. As Charles concluded, he looked directly at Camilla, the queen consort, who had waited decades to claim her place at the center of the royal family, had never been confronted so publicly with the consequences of her role in Diana's suffering. And what made it even more devastating was that Charles was not speaking as an enemy of the monarchy. He had made clear in his eulogy at Westminster Abbey that he and the Spencer family fully respected the heritage into which Diana's sons had been born. This was not a declaration of war on the institution. It was a declaration of truth, a refusal to let history be rewritten by those who had caused so much pain. But as the applause finally broke the silence, as cameras captured Camilla's frozen expression, one question hung in the air like the smoke after an explosion. What would the palace do now? The blue paper had created a legal reality that not even the king could challenge. The speech had created a public reckoning that could not be undone. And Charles Spencer, the brother who had stood over Diana's coffin and promised her sons would never suffer her fate, had made good on that promise in a way no one could have anticipated. If you enjoyed this documentary, like the video and subscribe.